organization that I work for is an international AIDS activist organization. We're dedicated to eliminating the barriers to HIV medications for the poorest people in the world. And we've been working on trade and access to medicines since 1999. We actually can end the AIDS pandemic in the next 30 years. And this is not hyperbolic. This is not, wear a condom and you can end AIDS, or wear a t-shirt, or go on a walk and you can end AIDS. We actually now know that if we get a cohort of people who are HIV positive onto AIDS medications, that it will be almost impossible for them to spread the virus. And if they can't spread the virus, then eventually we bend all curves. Deaths go down, and also new infections go down. And in about 30 years, if we get enough people onto treatment, we can actually see AIDS as something like polio. There'll be a couple thousand cases around the world of people living with AIDS. We'll have more than enough money to provide treatment to them, and there will be no new infections, hopefully. This is real. If you don't believe me, read the cover of The Economist, June 2011. So what do we mean by access to medicines? Access to essential medicines in developing countries is an issue dependent entirely on price. We have medications that can treat AIDS, and people don't have access to them just because of the price. You may have heard other reasons, like people don't know how to adhere to them in poor countries, there's some supply problems, but don't believe that. There are certainly problems always, but the driver is price. Obviously, pharmaceuticals are given a patent, and a patent on brand name drugs are usually way, way, way more than generic medications. A patent basically is a government-issued or a government-conferred monopoly. It usually lasts for about 20 years. A monopoly, as you all know from your basic economics class, equals no competitors and usually equals higher prices. The United States has a long history of limiting access and keeping affordable medicines out of the hands of poor people. So this TPP is not the only example of this, and I'll go through some of it. We hear a lot now about the importance of protecting intellectual property and the importance of protecting the ability for pharmaceutical industries to develop medications and be able to be sure that they'll make enough profit that they can continue to research and develop new types of medications that will save lives. Something that you should know, the industry, the pharmaceutical, big pharma, the companies that we know and love, and GlaxoSmithKline, all the companies that we hear about, Pfizer, they are actually very bad at developing new drugs. The vast majority of new drugs for all diseases are developed either at universities or by the government. The universities and the government are pretty bad at marketing them, so they just hand over their patents to pharmaceuticals. So don't believe the hype when you hear that the pharmaceuticals need to be able to make a huge profit, make a killing, because they need to put more money back into research and development. Because in fact, the much poorer public sector is the ones who are making the developments in terms of research. Everybody's agreed that we need to get together and do something about solving the AIDS crisis. The United Nations General Assembly is meeting right now, and they're talking about the Millennium Development Goals, which were developed almost 15 years ago. And they've come up with, one of them is providing universal access to HIV medications. The United States signed on to it, all the big rich countries signed on to it, and obviously we're not there anymore. I mean, we haven't reached that goal yet. And we're not going to by 2015. And so now they're talking about how can they weaken the goal that they agreed to and weaken the Millennium Development Goal. One of the things that I wanted to just say is that, the history of pharmaceuticals, the pharmaceutical industry, in getting the United States government to do its bidding and to stop access to HIV medications is long. So back in the day, when they were able to create something called the World Trade Organization's Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property, which is more commonly known as TRIPS. It was adopted in 1995, and it set the international minimum standards for intellectual property rights, including patents. Most developing countries signed on to TRIPS, thanks to pressure from the US government, and then that was the first time that they actually created or supported patents in their countries. After, there were some flexibilities built into that original agreement, and that wasn't enough for pharma, so they created something called TRIPS Plus. They came up with this concept of data exclusivity. So basically what that means for a pharmaceutical is, you have to do a clinical trial. You develop a drug, you have to spend a lot of money and a lot of time to make sure that it works. The data that's discovered as a result of that, pharmaceutical industry said, that's our property. We paid for that, so we're gonna keep it, and that should get a patent. So what happens for the generic producer is, they take a drug, it's the exact same molecular structure, they can make the drug, but they actually can't sell it to anyone because they need to put it through a clinical trial. And the clinical trial is expensive, and it's quite stupid. I mean, just think of it in terms of a generic that we all know. How many people know, Tylenol or acetaminophen? So it would be ridiculous after 20 years of using Tylenol successfully for another producer to suddenly put a bottle of acetaminophen out and then start testing it on people, because we have 20 years of history that we know that it works. And this is the exact same example for AIDS medications, for cancer medications, etc. So they created this new category of data exclusivity. They also decided that, maybe we could just flat out extend our patents. Like, why even pretend it's something else? Like, let's just do patent extensions. So some of these provisions can be up to 20 more years. So now you're talking about 40 years. And they also came up with this concept of evergreening, which that's the instance that you may have heard of where they change something about the drug very slightly or change what it's used for, and then they get another 20-year patent. So you can talk about you're looking at having a 60 or 80-year patent on your drug. Poor countries pushed back. And they were very confused about whether or not they were allowed to export and import generic medications. So there was something called the Doha Declaration. Bill Clinton actually supported the Doha Declaration. The Doha Declaration was supposed to affirm that the TRIPS agreement should not be interpreted or implemented in a manner that would make generic medications out of reach for poor countries. So the US got pissed off, because pharmaceutical lobby, they have 10,000 lobbyists, by the way, working every single day to promote their side and to limit actually fair trade for generic medications. So 10,000 people compared to probably there's, 5 people who work full-time on this and maybe occasionally meet with a Congress member. So it's a pretty uphill battle. They're the second most powerful to the financial industry in terms of lobbying and public relations. They were upset about that, so they did a bunch of things to undermine this Doha agreement and allow for generics. They came up with this concept of putting countries that develop generic medications onto something called the 301 watch list. And that's a trade watch list. It's the first step in diplomatic sanctions. So, you think of it like there's countries on there, of course, like Iran or Iraq. That's who you would think the United States would put on the list. But instead, we put countries like India, because India is what we call the pharmacy to the poor. They produce 80% of the world's generic medications. So now, there's been some pushback. Many of you may have heard, my organization actually started as a result of a South African medicines case. In 1997, there was a law passed in South Africa, Medicines and Related Substances Control Act. And Nelson Mandela realized that the AIDS epidemic in South Africa was so enormous that the vast majority of the population, the working population, would die. And there was actually economic predictors that the entire global economy would become unstable as a result of this, because South Africa was considered an anchor on the continent, et cetera, et cetera. So 39 drug companies sued Nelson Mandela's government, and I just love to think about like going home to your spouse and being like, what'd you do today, honey? Today I sued Nelson Mandela. You know, it's a great legacy. But we were able to push back against that. So then there's been some history of pharmaceuticals inserting the stuff into trade agreements, like Adam mentioned. Then that brings us to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And what's so incredible about the TPP is that it is the largest trade agreement. You know, people call it NAFTA on steroids. It's the largest trade agreement actually since the creation of the World Trade Organization. They hope to expand it to every single country that touches the Pacific, has been stated as one of their goals. What it means specifically for access to medicines is that it will deny people the right to oppose patents before they're granted. So if you're in a country and you need access to a medicine and you find out that that country is about to issue a patent, but you know that you could get a generic, you can't go and protest the government. You can't sue, you can't make a case. It would make clinical trial data corporate property for 12 years automatically. It would allow drug companies to make minor changes to old drugs, this concept of evergreening, and get a new 20-year patent. It would let drug companies, and this one's really incredible, and Adam touched upon it, sue government agencies that set reimbursement rates for public health programs if drug companies don't like them. So again, protecting investors and issuing investor rights over people's rights. So there are three basic things from the Trans-Pacific Partnership that we know. The access to medicine section was actually one of the ones that was released. One of the harmful rules is this data exclusivity, just in case you all want to remember. Another one is lowering the bar of patentability. The TPP will allow pharmaceutical companies to extend monopolies regardless of what they've done to change it. And then the last one is prohibit pre-grant opposition, so not allow people to protest before the patent is issued. So now to the point, and I have 3 minutes. Okay, so now to the point of what you guys can do. The one thing that you can do is you can meet with your Congress member and ask them to oppose the TPP, but also there's this opportunity, which I think people will talk about more, of just opposing fast track, the ability for the agreement to be rapidly and without much discussion or debate approved, which is exactly what Obama wants to do. You know, basically, get it under the rug, get it under the radar so no one knows about it. You should, and when you meet with a Congress member, if they say, like, we know all about the TPP, we think it's good agreement, you know, we're supporting fair trade, free trade, we think it's a free trade agreement, we're free traders, you know, it's good for our economy. Ask them this question. Have you ever read it? Because they haven't. They have not read it. Only one person has ever seen it. One Congress member has ever seen it. Actually, how many, like, I forget the number of how many corporate advisors have seen it.
600?
600, right. So there's a bunch of corporate people have seen it, but one Congress member got to see it. It was, you know, in a room. He couldn't bring any aids. He couldn't photograph it. He couldn't record it. And, you know, he just had a couple hours with it, and a lot of it was, like, redacted. And so none of your Congress members have seen it. It's nobody in New York, so none of them have seen it. So that is a great question to throw them off their game. Because, by the way, a lot of the New York representatives are pretty supportive of the TPP, as they have been of other free trade agreements. You can ask your Congress member to sign on to a letter that Congressmember DeLauro has written. So it's a letter from Congress members to their leadership to oppose this fast track part. So they don't even have to get into the technicalities of the TPP, or it doesn't even matter if they care about labor rights or access to medicines. This is just actually to say, let's at least debate it. Let's at least put it, you know, shine some light on it and have people discuss it. So let's not fast track it. You could do this. You could organize a teach-in about the TPP. You could hold a rally in front of your Congress member's office. That goes a long way, actually, get some media attention, get some of this into the, into the spotlight. I think most people would be incredibly pissed off if they found out that even a Congress member can't read the damn thing. So, we were lucky in terms of AIDS activists. We were lucky enough that someone leaked some of the text to us. But there are thousands more. I don't know how many pages. How many pages are there? Do you know how many pages? We don't actually know how many pages there are, of course. So there are lots of pages, and as Adam pointed out, only a few of them actually deal with trade.
NAFTA resulted in the loss of at least 700,000 jobs in the U.S. It also facilitated the exportation of cheap U.S. corn into Mexico, which resulted in the bankruptcy of over 1 million Mexican farmers. And NAFTA is not unique. The same economics are at work in every free trade agreement that facilitates offshoring jobs, like, for instance, the TPP. One aspect of the TPP has gotten very little attention, and please pay attention to this: the deregulation of financial institutions, financial markets. Even a limited and inadequate law like Dodd-Frank could be thrown out if it is deemed an unfair barrier to the future income of financial speculators. Think of the chaos that resulted from the meltdown in 2007 and 2008, and then think of that being institutionalized in an international agreement. We've already learned about how free trade agreements can supersede national and local laws, and this is clearly a direct assault on democracy. But it's not the only assault on democracy that's associated with free trade. Let me elaborate. Free trade agreements vastly increase income inequality, and study after study shows the greater the income inequality in the country, the less functional its democracy is. These various studies have all the charts and graphs and statistics to back them up, but basically they say what we already know: power follows money. The Center for Economic and Policy Research examined the effect free trade had on income distribution. They looked at the United States from 1990 to 2007, a period that covers the early years of the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA. Then they isolated income directly affected by free trade. And here's what they found. Free trade negatively impacted everybody's income except for the top 5%. Their income went up dramatically as a result of free trade. Ergo, more free trade equals more income inequality equals less democracy. Access to information is the lifeblood of democracy. The free trade, the Trans-Pacific Partnership will seriously restrict our access to information. As Jennifer was talking about, patents are going to be extended. Copyright laws are going to be tightened. There will be no distinction under the TPP between individuals who infringe on copyright for their own use, think photocopying a page from a book or making a disc of your favorite songs. No distinction between those individuals who infringe on copyrights and corporations who infringe on copyrights or throw out copyrights for profit. Internet intermediaries, Facebook, Twitter, the folks who facilitate your email or website would be liable if any of their users violate copyright laws. Every day, there are 58 million tweets. Over 600 million users use Facebook, and some 300 billion emails are sent. Think of the enormous bureaucracy and cost and the impact involved in all the internet, if all the internet intermediaries have to monitor every communication they handle. The background for this, of course, is we have a federal government that is already gathering massive amounts of information about us. At the same time, protecting its own secrets is among the government's top priorities. This is indeed a world turned upside down. War criminals are free to retire in luxury, while those who expose the war crimes may spend the rest of their lives in prison. As Julian Assange said, it's getting to the point where the mark of international distinction and service to humanity is no longer the Nobel Peace Prize, but an espionage indictment from the U.S. Department of Justice. There's a good and interesting article on the Rolling Stone website that talks about the new political prisoners, hackers, leakers, and activists. I recommend you look at it. As with several of the existing multinational agreements, under TPP, corporations will be able to sue national and local governments if they feel, as Adam was saying, that a law or policy may negatively impact their future profits. And who is it that passes judgment on these disputes? The majority of cases are decided by just 15 arbiters, almost all from the United States, Canada, or Europe. Several of them have been board members of multinationals. None of them have been elected or are in any way accountable to the public. Their decisions don't need to correspond to any nation's constitution or law. They only need to reference the particular trade or investment agreement in question. And one last point about democracy. People talk about how the TPP will be undemocratic. It's already undemocratic because it's being negotiated entirely in secret. As a member of Brooklyn for Peace, I can't help but consider the impact of the TPP on the international situation. Will the TPP promote peace, or will it create the conditions for war? I believe it does the latter. First, these free trade agreements, which promote inequality within and between nations, set up conditions that lead to war. Deregulation of national and local law inevitably leads to environmental degradation. This can and does result in the loss of arable land and potable water. It furthers climate change, bringing on droughts, floods, food shortages, and price increases for food. Free trade agreements wreak havoc on national economies through imposed structural adjustment and lead to mass unemployment. In practical terms, this translates to more economic instability, more poverty, and more shortages of the resources necessary for life. Already, there are hundreds of thousands of climate refugees and economic refugees. The TPP will inevitably increase those numbers exponentially. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is the economic arm of the United States' Asia pivot. For the first time since World War II, and after a decade of war in the greater Middle East, the United States is no longer the dominant power on the Pacific Rim. So President Obama announced the U.S. would shift the focus of its foreign policy to the Mideast, from the Mideast to Asia. One of the main objectives of the Asian pivot is the containment of China, which has soared economically while the U.S. was tied up in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the Asia pivot has to be understood not just as a political and economic maneuver, it is military as well. As Clausewitz famously said, war is the continuation of politics by other means. And this leads me to my final war-related point, imperialism. 60 years ago, two economic historians, John Gallagher and Ronald Robinson, published an important paper entitled The Imperialism of Free Trade. In that paper, the authors showed that imperialism is an uninterrupted reality of economic expansion, that imperialism's inner logic remains the same whether it takes the form of annexing colonies or expanding free trade. This is as true today as it was in 1839 when Britain launched the Opium Wars to force China to become a giant market for the British-owned opium factories in colonial India. It's worth noting that Britain's rationale for the Opium Wars was free trade. In climate action, we say, stop the war abroad, stop the war at home, stop the war on the planet. I think the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a good example of the connections between these three. We cannot stop any of these three wars unless we stop all of them.